I've known Tracy for such a long time now. I've been working in the sector for 20 years and I was privileged to do her training very early in my career. So you're someone who's inspired me and continue to inspire me through my career. So Dr. Tracy Westerman is a Nyamal woman from Pilbara, WA, and is a trailblazer in Aboriginal mental health, cultural competency and suicide prevention. She was the first Aboriginal person to attain a master's and a PhD in clinical psychology. She's founded the Indigenous Psychology Services in 1998 and has never received government funding for any of her work. She's delivered over 80 keynotes nationally and internationally in Canada, USA and New Zealand. I'm starting to get my nervous voice. Her PhD resulted in the development of the Westerman Aboriginal Symptoms Checklist, youth and adults, there's an abbreviation, and the only cultural and clinical valid tools for at-risk Indigenous youth. Following the 13 suicide deaths of Aboriginal young people in Kimberley in 2018, developed by Dr. Tracy Westerman Indigenous Psychology Scholarship Program with a donation of $50,000, and in 2022 launched the charity. The Westerman Jilla Institute for Indigenous Mental Health to drive Indigenous mental health and suicide prevention best practice. She works for no salary in its operations, sits on the boards and mentors the students for July. Supports 55 Indigenous psychology students, many of whom have now graduated. I'm very honoured to invite you here. Really, thank you, Tracy.
That was such an awesome introduction, and I tell you, it's so wonderful when I actually come back to places like this, and it's people who did my workshop like 20 years ago. It makes me feel old, of course, but you know, that just goes with the territory. So thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. So lovely. And guys, how cool is this, hey? I actually stay at the Sofitel, so it was like 2 minutes walk, which is actually pretty good for a Pilbara person because I can very easily get lost coming around Sydney. I just want to obviously acknowledge that I stand on Gadigal country of the Eora Nation. And obviously like to acknowledge that this land was never ceded. Look, I guess it's interesting as an eternal optimist, and of course we're all eternal optimists because we're on the treatment side of the equation, so we always have to believe in the possibility of change, don't we? That we always believe in that. And I signed up to believe in change when at 15 years of age as a kid from the Pilbara, I decided to become a psychologist, and that was despite never having met a psychologist in my life. Having to do all of my tertiary entrance subjects by distance education and having two parents that hadn't gone past year 3 in education in terms of, you know, I couldn't go to them and say, hey, help me with my homework. But despite that, I was actually parented to dream big. And I was so fortunate that I had parents who, despite coming from significant disadvantage themselves, taught me that you could be born into disadvantage, but that need not define you and it need not limit you. However, we are dealing in a really, interesting time post-referendum, hey? And I think the world will always judge us in terms of rightly what the referendum meant in terms of how we see ourselves as a country. I travel around this country a lot. Qantas loves me. I've got more frequent flyer points than an astronaut. And what I actually find is that I have a really good cross-section of the country in terms of what people are saying. And I'm sort of used to travelling around Australia and hearing sadness from people in terms of the rates of suicide and the rates of incarceration. I'm used to that. However, post-referendum, I was noticing something very different, and I was noticing anger. Now, it kind of makes sense because anger is a high energy state, sadness is a low energy state. Anger gives us a rest from vulnerability. And in terms of what we know, grassroots activism has always been what's made the most significant change, whether it's in Australia or whether it's internationally. And I learnt grassroots activism from a very, very strong woman whose footsteps I'm very proud to follow in, and that is my mum, Mavis Westerman. I'd like to honour her, and I'd also like to honour so many Indigenous people in leadership who, despite the no vote, continue to represent yes for us every single day. And my mum had to go to Port Hedland Court to get citizenship of her own country as an Aboriginal woman. Now, to get citizenship, she had to prove 3 things. She had to prove that she was free of disease, I'm quite serious. She had to prove that she could speak English, and she had to prove that she had severed ties with all of her family. Now, we're the only country that requires that we demonstrated that we'd severed ties with all of our family to get human rights restored, basic human rights restored. And we are now also the only culture in this entire country that requires that we now prove connection with our community and culture to get, I don't know what we get. So yes, the proof of Aboriginality is a continuation of the weaponisation of our culture against us. And how do you destroy a culture and dismantle it? You turn Aboriginal people on each other. This is the origins of it. So my mum, unbeknownst and unwittingly, got citizenship of her country, but what that meant is it created a divide between the haves and the have-nots. You think you're too good for us now, you've got that certificate of citizenship type stuff. And it's a really great colonialist bag of tricks, right? Because what they do is they go, excellent, we've turned them on each other, they're just going to do our jobs for us. Now, it's kind of interesting, hey, that my mum, my mum's a bit famous, right, in the Pilbara. And she's getting quite famous. And some of you might have seen as any of you follow me on social media, I did a book launch in Sydney Opera House with the lovely Stan Grant and Mum's bestie. And I posted this picture with me and Stan Grant, and it got less likes than Mum with Stan Grant. I was a bit cranky about that, but Mum's pretty famous, right? So, you know, well, Mavis. Now, if you sort of met Mavis, you'd probably call her fierce, right? So she's tall like me and she's black, right? Now we grew up in a pretty, you know, racist white mining town, you know, in terms of our upbringing. We're the only Aboriginal family in town back then. Aboriginal people turned up later on. But Mum, my entire life, I watched her take on racism like nothing else I've ever seen in my life, man. She would never, ever, ever take a backward step from racism to the point that you'd be embarrassed, you know, but also a little bit proud as well, you know. Now, when we were in our 20s, we found the certificate of citizenship, you know, because we were just searching through Mum's drawers, you know, as you do. You know, we search through your Mum's drawers for loose change and stuff like that. You don't do that? Okay. Searching through your Mum's drawers, you know. And we found this and we went, hey, what's this? And the shame of it that Mum felt, you can see she's ripped the picture there. And there was a shame in her in terms of why she did this. So there she was as this woman that was raising her kids to be black, strong and proud and be proud of their culture. How do you explain to your kids that you went to Port Hedland Court to renounce your culture because you couldn't be both an Aboriginal person and an Australian citizen at the same time? That was the law in WA that controlled Indigenous affairs at the time. How do you explain that to your kids that you're raising to be strong, black and proud? Well, you explain it as a mother's love. For the promises of assimilation with that, if you do this, if you get this citizenship, you'll have better opportunities for your kids. And what's your job as a parent? To create better opportunities for your kids than you had. But there's a lot of shame in being a victim. And that's what perpetrators rely on, to maintain your silence. And when people talk of truth-telling in this country, that's what actually maintains the silence, is that the people who are the victims of these kinds of policies continue to feel a sense of shame about it. Now, if there was an Olympics in denial of racism, Australia would easily be the gold medal contender. Easily. At least silver medal, right? So the thing about the thing about racism is that the denial of it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? And so what often happens is people become so confronted by the concept that racism is a thing that we can't engage in mature conversations about its realities for Indigenous people. Now, what we know, I guess, is that 30% of depression, at least, is accounted for by racism, okay? So let's actually sort of go backwards a little bit because I want to start with this because some of you who have been to my presentations before probably know that I'm not backwards and coming forwards in terms of my communication. It's quite funny, as you know, I don't have government funding and people sort of say to me, why have you never had government funding? And I said, well, ask the government, don't ask me. I don't have the answer to that, right? And I had a high-ranking government official say to me a few months ago, Tracy, the reason why you've never had government funding is because you've pissed a lot of people off. And my response to that was, if you're an activist and you haven't pissed people off, then you're doing it wrong, okay? You haven't got the assignment right? So kind of my job, I guess, as a grassroots activist is this. If everyone around the table is funded by government, who is holding the government to account? If everyone around the table is funded by government, then there's an implicit reward in the exclusion of the work of others that aren't government funded. The game is rigged that way, right? So in terms of what we know, in terms of people who have this ability to have grassroots needs met by people that aren't beholding to or silenced by government, That's a critical thing that we've never seen in this country before. And I take that responsibility very seriously. So I have no problem with pissing people off and poking people when I need to. This is the new Aboriginal. Activism used to be screaming and marching in the streets, and there's a role for that, 100%. But activism now is educated, it's nuanced, it's smarter than the non-Indigenous person that's across the table at you. You know, this is the new Aboriginal, and Australia has to get used to it. Okay, so let's actually look at. Thank you. So let's actually look at, in terms of where we're at in terms of Indigenous mental health, and you guys actually deal with lots of things in terms of comorbidities, right? So it's actually really challenging. My research back in 2000, when I did my PhD, developed the first unique psychometric tool, told us something that we probably already know. 28% of Indigenous people who present to services have at least risk for 3 or more co-occurring disorders, right? So that has significant impacts and implications for treatment as well as prognosis, yeah? And that makes it really challenging for you guys. And often, obviously, it's always going to be comorbid with alcohol and drug use. So, for example, depression, we know alcohol is a drug of choice for depression. Alcohol is a depressant, it feeds the cycle, right? And of course, we know that anxiety and depression tend to co-occur. We also know that if you have post-traumatic stress disorder, you're also likely to have substance abuse, and you're also likely to have depression. So it makes sense, given the origin of forced removal and the realities that biological and genetic contributions to trauma become generational, that we're going to have lots of comorbidities that we present with. And don't even get me started on culture-bound syndromes, okay? So we know that many things that look culturally normal mimic mental illnesses. However, we are a world that does not like difference, and it is literally killing my people. Everything that we're trained to provide services around in mental health and alcohol and drug industries and the whole gamut is predicated on cultural exclusion. I'm a proud psychologist, and we hang our hats on the concept that we are the scientist practitioner model. Different disciplines have different things they hang their hats on. The nurses are the patient advocates, right? The psychologists are the scientist practitioner model. The science informs the practice. But the science has all been predicated on cultural exclusion. So what then happens is, when you've got an at-risk Aboriginal person in front of you, where's the science that you have to be able to inform how you work effectively with that client? Universities have dropped the ball when it comes to ensuring that people are trained in a way that can ensure our most vulnerable communities have the best practice services we can provide. So 20 years ago, I guess, when I first came down from the Pilbara, walking around like the Yeti on campus with... I didn't stand out at all. I was so cool because I had 3 pairs of tracksuit pants that my mum sewed for me, and I thought they were the coolest thing ever. They were in 3 different colours: yellow, blue, and red. And I'm like, what? This is not the #1 fashion statement in Perth. I was really devastated by that. And I didn't look. I came into university and I thought, I'm going to learn all this amazing stuff that's going to help my people. 3 years in, the word Aboriginal was not mentioned once. There is no greater injustice than to feel invisible, than to feel as if your pain matters less. And that's what happens in terms of the realities of Indigenous people, that we're not in the curriculum, we're not in the training provided to practitioners. And then when things go awry in terms of horrible things that occur to us, there's often stone cold silence that from the media, from politicians alike, and those sorts of things. So what I actually did was I set up on a path to actually fix that, which sounds like kind of a big task to undertake, but I can't be accused of ever taking on easy things, okay? And as one of my elders said to me, Bub, if it was easy, everyone would do it. So let's actually look at the state of play. I want to get through this as quickly as I can, because statistics sort of tell you something until they don't, and some of you will be aware of this stuff anyway. But in terms of the burden of disease, I think a lot of the myths that exist are actually, you know, it's this thing about a lie. It can travel around the world while the truth is still putting its shoes on, right? And we are in the information overwhelming age, and there's a good thing, there's a good bit about that, but Trumpism and fake news and all these sorts of things actually mean that people are overwhelmed by information. So what I find my role often is actually to separate the fact from the fiction, but to also be really good at actually looking for things in a way that people can understand what the truth is. So the smoking and alcohol related issues, I guess people have this sense that Aboriginal people are all stereotypically drunk and we're all demonised on the basis of all this sort of stuff. What we actually know, I guess, is that there's been massive reductions, so you can see the statistics there. There's been massive reductions in terms of the rates of harmful drinking with Aboriginal people. And what we know, of course, with increasing literacy, of course you're going to find that people aren't going to be aware of the impacts of smoking or the impacts of alcohol. So obviously our remote communities carry a greater burden of these things than our urbanised communities for those reasons. So people aren't educated around, you know, the impacts and the risk. However, the thing that I think that people don't know, and the myth that exists around, is that Indigenous people are more likely to be non-drinkers than non-Indigenous people, right? But those Indigenous people who do drink are significantly more likely to engage in harmful drinking. Now, of course, this what we then know is that I want to talk a little bit about this concept of geomapping, okay? So geomapping essentially means that there are certain communities that carry more of the burden of everything, and we're talking about suicides, we're talking about child removals, we're talking about intimate partner violence. And the reason why I'm banging on about geomapping so much is because the so-called problem is much easier to solve than politicians let you believe. And it frustrates me so much that I actually wrote my memoir, I actually wrote the last chapter on how to close the gap in 6 steps, because it's so frustrating in terms of the actual number of Indigenous people that are carrying the burden of generational risk and how identifiable they are. Okay, so let's actually look at the state of play and the unacceptable gaps. I guess the first thing, most of my work has been in the suicide prevention space, for those of you who follow my work. And basically, you can't dress these statistics up. Every time an Indigenous child dies by dies in this country, 40% of them will do so by suicide. Child and suicide does not belong in a sentence. And what separates Australia from arguably every developed country in the world is the age at which our young people are taking their lives. Now, I'll talk about that in terms of, you know, why I developed a charity around this, predominantly because we have had suicides through the roof in my own state of WA for a very long time, mostly centred around the Kimberley region. And what governments do is they love to have an inquiry. Stop with the inquiries already. So what actually happens is government, it buys them time. They go, oh, we'd love to do something about that issue. However, we're just waiting for the inquiry to finish. So what happened in WA, we had 4 government inquiries into suicides in the state, mostly around the Kimberley. The last one was the Fogliani inquiry into the 13 deaths by suicide of Indigenous young people. 13 Indigenous young people took their lives. And they had another inquiry. The latest data tells us that the Kimberley still has the highest rates of suicide, Indigenous suicide in the country by country mile, and they've had 4 inquiries there. So that's what inquiries give us, guys. Governments buys them time. Aboriginal people feel as if we're being heard, and everything stays the same. Coroners aren't psychologists. They don't understand human behaviour very well, and they also don't understand Indigenous people very well. So the recommendations often read like a retrospective, you know, archaic retrospective on human behaviour that stereotypes and demonises Indigenous people, blaming things like the alcohol, sexual abuse, all these sorts of things. And these sorts of things do not actually provide us with any opportunities for causal pathway, focus in terms of reduction of suicides. So I'll get to that in a moment, but essentially what happens is it gives us nothing new, right? Okay, incarceration, guys, we are incarcerating black people at the world's highest rates, officially. And in WA, because we have the highest rates in the country, we are officially incarcerating black people at the world's highest rates. Now that means 6 times higher during South African apartheid, just for perspective, okay? So we have a prison love affair and an early intervention allergy. And as you know, the Northern Territory recently went backwards on the age of criminal responsibility. They raised the age to 12 and then they went back to 10. Now, what we don't want in terms of leadership is for people to go backwards in terms of the best possible science that we know. And what we know is this: the earlier you incarcerate someone, the greater that predicts future criminality, right? We know that. 94% of children who are incarcerated will go back to prison before they turn 18. It costs $1 million a year to keep a kid in prison. Now, given that, if you put that $1 million per kid into early intervention and prevention, you would only need a 6% success rate to justify that $1 million per kid. It's nuts when you say it out loud, isn't it? Some of the things in terms of what people aren't aware of, and the data and absence of it, which is absolutely a human rights violation in this country, is that 87% of kids in prison are on remand. That means not charged with a crime. It gets better. We actually have no data on what kids are being convicted of. Read the data properly. It says charges proceeded against by police. So when politicians say things like, we've got all these horrific crimes being committed, we actually don't know what types of crimes kids are committing because it's charges proceeded against by police, not convictions. Hopefully this makes sense to people. What this means is that early intervention becomes impossible, because if we don't know the types of crimes kids are committing, we then can't design intervention programs around ensuring that those types of crimes are actually targeted in terms of prevention activities, right? So it's absolutely crazy. What we know is for every single crime that gets prevented, there's a $35 return on investment for every single crime that gets prevented. So you can't mount any argument. I can mount every argument. I can mount a future predictor of criminality argument. I can mount an economic argument. But here's the reality. We love prisons. Everyone wants to lock up a 10-year-old until it's their 10-year-old. But the people who are making the decisions about locking up 10-year-olds know very comfortably that it's never going to be their 10-year-old, because it's always black 10-year-olds that are getting locked up. Okay, but we have an early intervention allergy and a prison love affair. Okay, child removals, it gets better. I'll try and dress this up, guys, because these statistics are hard to dress up. 11 times the rate in terms of, so we are officially at the same levels of at the stolen generations level officially. So when people say things like we need to be careful here because we're going to end up with another stolen generations, we're already here. They estimated 25,000 people were removed during the stolen generations. We are now at 25,000 officially. So that means that we're at the same level as stolen generations. So when people say sorry, how about stop doing things you have to say sorry for, right? So what we actually know is that there are certain things. I'm a very outcome-driven person. I'm a very data-driven person. So you're going to actually understand when we get through the presentation why we're actually not closing that gap. And a lot of it is because we actually don't have the expectation of data-driven outcomes that actually show risk reduction across all these different areas. And that's why the gap and how to close it is actually really simple. And it frustrates me that people are making this gap out to be much more difficult to solve than it actually really is. Indeed, if you close the gap in remote communities, you close the gap everywhere. Okay? Our highest risk, most vulnerable communities are always our most remote ones. And guess what? Surprise, surprise. They've also had the most human rights restrictions perpetuated on them. Cashless welfare cards, alcohol restrictions. So what actually happens is people are perpetuating learned helplessness in whole cohorts of people. We know that learned helplessness is the strongest predictor of suicides. It's the strongest predictor of every single poor outcome that you can possibly imagine when people don't have agency over their lives. Okay. Australian Institute of Health and Welfare collect that data, and they have most states that have signed up to that data. However, when you look at sort of the reasons for the removal, some really interesting things come out. And I think when I crunched this data, I was sort of, to be honest with you, it took the wind out of me a little bit. Because what people believe is that Indigenous kids are being removed for things like sexual abuse, for things like, extreme physical abuse. I was a child protection worker for 7 years, and risk has a context to it, and it also has a continuum to it. So, for example, someone comes in with head lice all the way through to sexual abuse, right? So that's a risk continuum. Now, I was a child protection worker for 7 years, and this is my lived experience. It was very rare that I would see an example of, sexual abuse in an Aboriginal community perpetuated by an Aboriginal person. And they're the sorts of things, absolutely, that removal is almost guaranteed around that, right? If you don't have the mums who are protective and all those sorts of things, right? Now, when you actually look at the reason why Aboriginal people are being removed, 82% of it, 82% is for neglect. Now, that's the most preventable, low-risk category of abuse that you can possibly imagine. And what that means is people come in and say, hey, I'm struggling with my parenting. I'm struggling, please help me, right? And so then you proactively get in there and do everything you can to keep families together. So the fact that that data is where it is absolutely shocking to me. So what I'm going to do with this presentation is I'm going to explain the data to you, and then I'm going to explain the why of that and how to fix it in terms of how we get to the end of it. Okay. Mental health prevalence unknown. This is nuts. That's a technical term. The technical term alert, right? It's also a Pilbara term. Sometimes the Pilbara comes out every now and again. Okay, so every single thing in terms of the gap arguably has mental health underlying it as causal. People end up in prison because of trauma. People end up in child protection because of generational core attachment loss. People end up with you guys because of mental health comorbidity, right? So we have no data on Indigenous mental health in this entire country. Don't worry, I'll personally fix this, so I'll get to that in a moment, okay? So, if you're not even measuring a gap, how are you going to close a gap? If you haven't defined the problem, then there is no problem. So we just wait for suicides to be rampant, rather than addressing things like depression and suicide and trauma, which are obviously the causal pathways, the journey to suicides, right? So if we have no data on this, indeed the World Health Organisation has said for a long time, your best opportunity of reducing the burden of disease is get out your bloody notepad, day one on the job. Your first job is to define the problem. So if you don't even know what burden of disease we have in terms of mental health, then there is no problem. The Close the Gap, all the Close the Gap does is every year it names demographic data. How many kids have died? How many people have been removed? What age they were? What geographical location they are? You know what the problem with that demographic data? It's not therapeutically alterable. So if they'd literally made the new Close the Gap metric treatment outcome, you would literally close the gap. Because then what people would have is they have to be signed up to actually demonstrate treatment outcome with everything they're doing, right? We'll get to that in a moment in terms of funding of prevention. Okay. Excluded from the latest ABS survey on intimate partner violence. So despite the fact that Indigenous women are 35 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to die at the hands of their intimate partner, we're excluded from the latest intimate partner violence survey, which actually told us something that probably makes sense, that most women are staying with violent partners because they don't have the economic means to leave. Okay, so that's pretty important information to have. Hello, cashless welfare cards. So now they put cashless welfare cards in remote communities for our most vulnerable people. Our most vulnerable people, I'm going to go through the stats in a moment, are Indigenous women on remote communities. So what they're doing now is they're making them even more vulnerable. And they have the gall to call cashless welfare cards violence prevention. It's not violence prevention, it's cashless welfare cards. So you're literally quarantining the limited money of the poorest, most vulnerable people in this country, and you have the gall to call it violence prevention. So that's the sort of stuff that we become used to as Indigenous people, that any time we have pain, government responds to our pain by inflicting more pain, okay? So we do not collect data. This is the most important thing. People actually think that in every single instance where an Indigenous woman is a victim of intimate partner violence, that they just make the assumption that their perpetrator is an Indigenous man. There is literally no data, no complete data set that actually identifies the ethnicity of the victim and the ethnicity of the perpetrator. The data doesn't exist. So when people start defending the violence in Indigenous communities, what they need to say is they need to say, hey, show me the data, because it does not exist. What it actually says is, do you know your perpetrator? And of course, it's intimate partner violence, so people say, I know my perpetrator. People assume that the perpetrator is an Indigenous man in every single case. Let's now go to the ABS data. The ABS data tells us that up to 72% of Indigenous people are married to non-Indigenous people. That's my lived experience in my family as well, okay? So, in terms of what we know, we just don't have the data on it. Now, the point of all this, though, is that violence is a human issue. I'll put this up here so that people get it. I'm being asked often if I believe there's a culture of violence in Aboriginal communities. My answer to that is any offender is enabled by a culture, by those who normalise and minimise violence, feed their sense of entitlement and demonise victims. Violence is a human issue, not a black person issue. Now, I know opportunistic offenders, and you know what opportunistic offenders do? Opportunistic offenders look for opportunities to get away with their offending. And if I was an opportunistic offender, I'd want to find the person who had the least power that I could actually dominate. And the people in this country that have the least power are Indigenous women on remote communities. So the vulnerability of those Indigenous women on remote communities means that opportunistic offenders know that they can plant themselves in Indigenous communities and no one is going to actually come to the rescue of Indigenous women. And we know that based on the police data. We know that when Indigenous women ring the police, a couple of things happen. They either don't come, they are under-policed. The second thing that happens is they are very consistently, erroneously labelled as the perpetrators of the violence. Now, this is a very common offender-victim dynamic too, by the way, guys. It happens with non-Indigenous women as well. So the reason for this is basically because of how the dynamic looks. So the perpetrator of the violence is not struggling with trauma symptoms, right? They're also controlling the dynamics of the relationship. So often the perpetrator looks calm. So the police will come and they'll say, I'm just trying to help this person. The victim looks like the crazy one, screaming, please help me, all those sorts of things, right? So what often happens is, absolutely, the victim looks like they're often the perpetrator of the crime. The other thing too, hopefully I'll get time to talk about this thing called the fawn trauma response. And the fawn trauma response often looks as if, again, victims are actually the perpetrators of violence. I'll explain to you what this looks like. A normal trauma response when you're a victim is flight-fight. People know about the flight or fight response. So the flight or fight response is basically the brain says threat, and it sends a signal to your body to enable you to either fight, as in defend yourself, or flight, as in run away. But what happens in situations where flight or fight is not available? You can't fight them, you can't run away from them. So what's left? Fawn. And I see this in most of my Indigenous clients. And fawn trauma is something that has very little research around it, but essentially fawn is other rather than self-directed. And it means that compliance can be part of it. So you're going along, look as if you're going along with the abuse. The other thing that I see a lot of is victims who push buttons in their perpetrators, and I'll explain this before I get the feminist police after me, right? I'm going to just calm down, just hold on to that for a second, right? Just calm down, hold on to that for a second. Essentially, what happens is when you're in a violent relationship, you're on eggshells, right? And explosion can happen at any time, and the lack of control and fear around that means that often victims will push buttons to control the conditions and circumstances under which violence occurs. Does that make sense to people? It looks crazy, but it actually makes sense. The other reason also is because hot anger, explosive anger, can kill people. If you control the conditions and circumstances under which violence occurs, then survival is much more likely. So these are the sorts of things that can actually look as if, again, victims of violence look like perpetrators of it. Okay, let's look at some solutions, because you guys are here for solutions. Well, the first thing is that we need to determine unique causal pathways. So many years ago, I decided to develop, unique psychometric tools, and I guess what we know is that Indigenous people have unique risk characteristics, okay, that we need to understand. And if we don't understand those, then they can't be the focus of our intervention and prevention activities, if you like. I've been doing a lot of talking, and hopefully I'll have a paper released very soon on the concept of racial trauma. I'm arguing that racial trauma should be considered to be a separate trauma category, because it's both inescapable and enduring. You can't escape your cultural identity, you can't escape your blackness, okay? But what it actually means for Indigenous people is we get othered. So you have individual trauma, and then you have this stereotypical notion of what Indigenous people should be. That's called the other race effect, and the other race effect essentially means that the brain literally processes blackness as more threatening than whiteness. They've done studies on this in terms of the amygdala reacting differentially to blackness compared to whiteness. So what that means is that for an Indigenous person, straight away people have a sense of fear, or a sense of more risk, if you like. They also have the other racial neuroscience that I want to talk about is this thing called the racial empathy gap. So again, the brain literally processes the pain of black people as less than the pain of white people. So these are just introductory concepts, and I'll get to talking about how they manifest themselves in terms of the ongoing risk stuff that we see. Okay, so unique causal pathways have never been data determined. So what I did was I set upon a path to figure out the why. So all causal pathways do, guys, is they answer the why. Why do we have so many kids in care? Why do we have so many people in prison? Why do we have so many people killing themselves? So a causal pathway actually answers that, okay? Risk factors don't. So for example, in the suicide space, if we know that the journey to suicide means that most people have depression, then that's actually really cool, because then we get really good at best practice treatments of depression. So the why informs the what to do about it. Causal pathways inform treatments of best practice. But no one's actually done that before with Indigenous people. So when I developed my psychometric tools, we developed them from the ground up, and we said to Aboriginal people, hey Aboriginal people, they said yes. What sorts of things do you, all of them, what sorts of things do you, and that was just my family at the family barbecue over the weekend. It's a pretty sophisticated research project we actually undertook, and Mavis was the leader of that research, of course. So we actually said, what do you notice in the build up to an act of suicide? Design things from the ground, our tools are designed from the ground up. Not taken off a shelf, mainstream adapted, from the ground up, purpose built. Here's the thing about mainstream assessment tools. They have inherent error, which I'm going to get to. So there's that bit. You can misdiagnose, overdiagnose and underdiagnose. You can do all that sort of stuff. However, the most important thing with mainstream assessment tools is what's not in there, right? So when we actually did our research, we found that there were unique causal pathways for suicide. We found that the suicides were wholly impulsive. Most non-Indigenous suicides are fed by depression. I go, whoa, we didn't expect that. That's what happens when you develop things from the ground up. You find stuff that you would never have expected. So most of our suicides are wholly impulsive. That's very common when people have attachment loss and trauma, right? They don't have the ability to self-regulate, access higher level thinking, all that sort of stuff. Remember, the why informs the what to do. So now our treatments of best practice are, how do we fix impulsivity? Well, we teach people distress tolerance skills and a whole range of other things, right? So that's actually really cool in terms of how we go about the science of how we fix some of this stuff. Okay, how are we going, guys? We feeling okay? You're a bit quiet today. A bit quiet. Okay. Now, the why of overrepresentation is obviously forced removals. Okay, so people know John Bowlby's work in terms of attachment theory. I guess if you don't know attachment theory, just mainline it, guys. You just literally get into it at a level that, you know, generational trauma we know is getting passed through I call them the same families again and again and again, right? So I'll make sense of this. You go to any high-risk community, you go to Walgett, you go to Alice Springs, you go to Cherbourg, you go to Kimberley, they're really easily identifiable hotspots, right? I reckon you'll find about 10 to 15 families at best that are making up the bulk of the service provision, right? I bet that's going to happen. You know, another thing that's going to happen, if you work in this industry for long enough, you'll have a client. That client will have kids. One of those kids will become your client. So what's happening here is their generational risk is being passed through families unabated. And that's why it's frustrating to me, because the actual number of people that are making up the data is actually much smaller than what people actually think. I want to show you the data on this in a moment, and it's actually quite shocking in a good way, in a solvable way. Okay, so Bowlby actually said that critical to a child's development is secure attachment to parents. Okay, we also know that not all trauma is equal. Some trauma, like forced removal from families, and generationally takes time to recover from. Because your family, your parents, it's biologically hardwired in you to want the love and acceptance of your parents. But how you develop a sense of secure attachment is in the environment's capacity to respond to the whole range of positive and negative emotions, but that starts with that biological hardwiring that parents provide for you. And there's no other attachment relationship that's more important than the parental attachment relationship. So what happens when you lose that? How do you then teach your own children how to love, how to care, how to be kind, how to be all those sorts of things, how to self-regulate emotions, and how to pass that on to their own kids if they've never had that taught themselves in their own backgrounds? Well, it becomes really almost impossible. We know, for example, that the survivors of the Holocaust, the grandchildren of the survivors of the Holocaust have low cortisol levels, right? We haven't done this research in Australia, but that actually tells us that there's a biological contribution that gets passed through generations, actually. And we know that if you have a parent who has trauma, you have a 20% likelihood of inheriting that just through your genes, right? So that's the vulnerability part that occurred with forced removal, and we're still continuing it. We know that forced removal or removal from families is the pipeline to everything, right? It's the pipeline to the justice system. It's the pipeline to, you know, to mental ill health. So we need to fix child removal if we're going to fix anything. Biology becomes altered, as we know. Now, the big thing, I guess, in terms of, I talk a lot about, post-trauma variables. And post-trauma variables, the biggest post-trauma variable that makes trauma worse is actually when your trauma's denied. Okay, so you talk to any victim and they'll say that the actual denial of my trauma was worse than the trauma itself. So when people actually deny your trauma, so the removal was denied for a long time, don't forget. So decades and decades and decades where forced removal was denied. Now that's crazy making for victims, because what happens is you question your own trauma anyway. But from a position of science, let's explain the position of science here. When people come in to see me as a psychologist, they don't say, hey Trace, I'm experiencing trauma from my forced removal as a kid. If they said that, I'd be very impressed, right? I'd be very impressed. They never name the cause. They come in and they say, hey Trace, I'm screaming at the kids. Hey Trace, I'm drinking too much. Hey Trace, I'm having relationship after relationship after relationship that's just not serving me well. They come with all of these behaviours, all these things that are actually problematic in their life. My job is to explain the why of that, right? Now the problem is when you deny the forced removal, what actually happens is people don't have this wonderful thing called insight into the fact that their behaviours are trauma-based behaviours, right? So then that means that it virtually guaranteed the intergenerational transmission of trauma. Its actual denial guaranteed it, right? Hopefully that makes sense to people, right? Because what it actually does is it compounds the initial trauma. Okay, guys, I want to talk about alcohol restrictions for a little bit because, of course, you guys love alcohol restrictions because they're cool. Um, okay, you guys know the evidence base around this stuff. I don't have to teach you to suck eggs around this. Okay, but of course what we know is alcohol restrictions, despite the fact that they don't work, they are also called all sorts of things that they shouldn't be called. They're called suicide prevention, they're called all sorts of things, right? They're called violence prevention, they're called that sort of stuff. So of course we know that those things are actually, they co-occur, right? But of course it's not as simple as that in terms of, yes, alcohol is a strong enabler to suicide, but it's not a cause. Alcohol might be a strong enabler to violence, but it's not a cause, right? So it's a very different thing. Risk factors versus cause are actually very different. Okay, so this is what we know. You know, when Anthony Albanese went to Alice Springs after they removed the alcohol restrictions in Alice Springs a couple of years ago, and it was really interesting in terms of what happened because people were going, there are only about 10 communities that were left anyway that didn't have alcohol restrictions, so everyone just needs to calm down, just calm down, calm down. Okay, so what happens when people have no human rights and then you give their human rights back to them? You know what happens? There's chaos. There's a reaction of chaos. It's a bit like when you go from an autocracy to a democracy. You know what they do? They send the army in, they send massive supports in because they expect chaos, right? So when they remove restrictions, of course there was going to be chaos. But they saw the chaos and they went, oops, didn't expect that. And then they reacted to the chaos by bringing the restrictions back in. Now this is the problem. Chaos is a necessary part of human behavioural change. So the minute you actually remove the restrictions, they should have put massive supports into Alice Springs expecting that chaos. You know, detox services, all those sorts of counselling support, all that sort of stuff, before people get accustomed to having human rights again. I mean, this is Australia. I can't even believe I'm saying this stuff out loud, right? Okay, so once you remove human rights restrictions, there's a human reaction to it. That means chaos. If you go back to restrictions in response, you take people back to the first stage of behavioural change. Does that make sense to people? So that's kind of what happens is because we know that, you know, alcohol restrictions and restrictions of human rights are actually the core driver of so many of these poor outcomes. For example, in the Northern Territory, since the Northern Territory intervention, there's been a 160% increase in suicides. It's not about the alcohol. It's about the fact that every single day you are treated differently to the non-Indigenous person next to you because of the colour of your skin. Not because you've done something naughty or something bad. You actually have less human rights than the person next to you. It's not about the alcohol. It's about the fact that you don't have a sense of hope because you were treated differently based on your skin colour. So it's not about the alcohol, it's about the sense of hopelessness and helplessness that the environment actually feeds you because of your racial identity. Okay, now, why all roads lead to assessment, guys? Because if you get assessment wrong, you get treatment wrong, you make things worse, okay? So what we did, assessment also enables us to data determine causal pathways, enables us to develop data-driven evidence-based prevention programs. All roads lead to assessment. Get assessment wrong, get treatment wrong, get assessment right, get treatment right. So you have all these capabilities if you get culturally informed psychometric assessments. People then become data-driven. We develop robust data on what's working for people. There's a whole raft of things that are actually really important in terms of why culturally informed assessment is really important. Of course, I've talked about the work that we've done a little bit around the psychometric tools. I'm going to unpack it a little bit more. Of course, you guys know about the IRIS. That's a Indigenous-specific tool that's been developed for the alcohol and drug industry, which is great. Assessment saves lives, guys. So 13 Indigenous young children died in the Kimberley without a mental health assessment. That's the day I very rarely have moments where I feel broken. And as someone who developed the first screening tool for at-risk Aboriginal people for suicide in the year 2000, and the government have never supported it and rolled it out and all the rest of it, that broke me. And I think for me, that's when I started the Dr. Tracy Westerman Indigenous Psychology Scholarship Program. Children should not be dying from want in a world of great excess. And yet every inquiry continues to tell us that our children are dying because of lack of access to culturally competent services. This should not be our reality in a developed country. And that's why I knew I could fix this, and we'll get to the good news in a moment in terms of the Dr. Tracy Westerman Indigenous Psychology Scholarship Program. We have obvious bias in mainstream assessments, but this is not something that they tell us because they perpetuate this myth called the null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis means that we actually don't have any evidence of bias. It's actually, the burden is on you guys to prove that there's bias, right? And so, of course, you have very few people who are capable of doing data-driven research, especially in psychology and Indigenous psychology, that, of course, that research and that evidence base doesn't get challenged to the extent that it should. So we know that there's bias and IQ tests. We know criminogenic tools are also have error. There's a couple of things that are going on in terms of we're looking at validating our tools for the criminogenic environment, which will actually be really cool in terms of we're getting there. Mental health inventories, often what happens is you have a overdiagnosis of things like depression because of this thing called the yes syndrome. So with Aboriginal people, we will agree with negatively phrased items. Depression inventories are quite negatively phrased, so people score higher cut-off scores. So that's just one example of why mainstream assessments actually get a misread. The other one you guys might be aware of is in child protection, the Queensland Child Safety has just removed the structured decision-making tool because of racial bias in child protection. So what it actually does is it conflates parenting differences with risk, and that might sound like a really big call, but if I had time to unpack it, I would. I'll see how I go. I'll save that for Ron, as in later on, and see if I get there. Okay. No clinical guidelines around culture-bound syndromes. Okay, so when you have people, and particularly in the alcohol and drug industry, you guys are going to see this a lot. People that have alcohol and drug-induced psychoses, and then you have people that have spiritual visits of deceased loved ones that are very normal for us as Aboriginal people, and then you have people that have schizophrenia or psychoses. So which one's correct, right? So I published the first paper on culture-bound syndromes in the country in 2021. Now, it won the L-Metrics Award for the biggest global reach of a paper. And it doesn't surprise me because people were desperate to try and figure stuff out. So essentially what it does, guys, is it takes you through a differential cultural diagnosis. Is it clinical or is it cultural? And it takes you through the steps to be able to do that across all the different disorders. Okay, now I'm going to flick through a bit of stuff because I want to get into some more solution stuff. So I just want to, I've only got 16 minutes. Is that right? I've got 16 minutes left? Whatever, just keep going, whatever. As long as I don't miss my flight, I'm fine. Okay, so unique tests developed over 25 years, and so we've got quite a few. I've forgotten which ones I've developed because there's so many of them. Okay, Westerman Aboriginal Symptom Checklist, Youth and Adults. Now, those two are screening tools for suicide, depression, alcohol and drugs, and they also look at cultural resilience. Now, the great thing about those tools is that I have trained 50,000 people in them. That sounds a lot when you say it out loud. It sounds like a lot, doesn't it? Right? And that's just my hometown, right? They all came along. 50,000 people. Now, the great part about that is, you know how we have no mental health data? We fixed that last year. So we published the first paper with 1,216 Indigenous young people. We're about to publish the adult version, which actually tells us, gives us the first Indigenous mental health database, which is pretty cool. Okay? So you've got that. We fixed that. Now, the thing is, no heavily funded academic institution has done this. No heavily funded research organisation has done this. I personally paid to have this done. Now, the great part of it also, and there's more, I recently paid to have these tools go digital. Now, what this means is that you can literally screen an Aboriginal person just with access to your phone. How good's this? More excitingly, we have a research arm in my charity, the Westerman Institute for Indigenous Mental Health. So you know those 50,000 people that have been accredited? We are now signing MOUs with them so that we can actually sign them so they can actually share their data with us, so we can capture Indigenous mental health data in real time for the first time across this entire country. It's a really exciting body of work, guys. And what that means is that our highest risk communities will have their mental health and the problem defined for the first time in this country. So when you've got, say, Alice Springs and places like that, we don't know how much depression there is in Alice Springs. We don't know how much trauma there is. So we're going to be able to actually tell them and do that for free for them, which means that they can then go and argue to government for funding commensurate with that need. Also, importantly, they have a baseline against which to measure the impacts of prevention services. And this has all been done without government funding. Okay, now the other thing that I've done, because I just, with the tools, people kept coming to me and saying, hey Trace, we're pretty remote, we don't have access to a psychologist and services and stuff. What happens if we find an Aboriginal kid at risk? That's a really good question. So what I did was I developed two more products. The first product is it generates a treatment plan, so the young person or the adult does a symptom checklist and a treatment plan gets generated from that. So a culturally informed treatment plan. What I've also developed is a culturally informed interview process. So it literally says, hey, ask this question, hey, ask this question, hey, ask this question, depending on how the Aboriginal person's actually answered on the assessment tool. So it literally guides you in terms of what to ask and how to ask it, because a lot of people really struggle culturally with at-risk Indigenous people, right? So that actually guides you around it. Okay, now, despite all that though, this is what the APS guidelines say, that there are no culturally informed tools, but fails to mention any tools that should be used. Now, in terms of, yes, we'll flick through that. So there are all my validation studies, okay, but there are no culturally valid and culturally informed assessment tools. Now, unique assessment number 3 is the acculturation scale for Aboriginal Australians, and this is actually a really important tool that enables you to kind of get a sense of cultural identity, and we teach you how to treat cultural identity. That might sound really weird, but essentially we know that Indigenous people who have a strong, robust sense of cultural identity aren't our clients. But people don't know the sorts of things that actually drive risk. When is culture a risk factor? When is it a protective factor? This helps you to actually tell the difference and also track cultural identity development over time. The next assessment tool that we have is called the Acculturative Stress Scale for Aboriginal Australians. Now, the cool thing about this, quite a few things, is it validates racial trauma as an actual thing, right? So because it data drives it and actually tells us the sorts of characteristics that people have in relation to racial trauma. And of course, once you identify those factors, they can be the focus of your treatment because you can use it as an outcome kind of measure. Okay, the next thing, I guess, is determining treatments of best practice. Now, some of you who follow me, I'm going to get into the Dr. Tracy Westerman Indigenous Psychology Scholarship Program in a moment, but we have just literally launched the first National Indigenous Psychology Treatment Centre out of Perth. And we pay for this by music concerts and fundraising and me pimping myself out everywhere that I can possibly pimp myself out. I see a rich person, I go, hey, rich person, you're my new best friend. So the great thing about that is that, we can then determine treatments of best practice for the first time. So we've just signed literally today our first Gilia office in Perth, so it's awesome. So thank you, it's very exciting. And it's exciting because we have a base now, so we're obviously wanting to have a base across every state of Australia. We start with Perth, and we're going to kit that out, so we'll have observation rooms and we'll be testing treatments of best practice for the first time. So no one's done that really in Australia around, depression, around, trauma, around attachment-based classifications and all sorts of stuff. So if I talk really fast, you'll know why, because we are sprinting, okay? Now, the big thing, of course, is determining the causal contribution of racism. Now, I've also developed 3 different cultural competency tools, and the value of these things is that you can actually, once cultural competency has been defined, it can then be improved. So I'm going to go into those in a minute. But first what I want to do is I want to talk about the impact of having Indigenous workers, and particularly having, Indigenous workers in the space, and what impact that actually has on data in terms of outcome. So I'm going to mention the orange one. When you think things are bad, you just look at America and you go, yeah. Okay, if people think that white privilege doesn't exist, that guy became president twice and he's an imbecile, right? And then Elon Musk is not far behind, he's the richest man in the world, right? Okay, so Donald Trump recently referred to immigrants stealing black jobs. Now, he's not the first person to feel that way about Indigenous people or black people, he's just the person who's dumb enough to say it out loud, right? Let's see how other race effect plays itself out. We need more Aboriginal health workers, say politicians. We need more social emotional wellbeing workers, say politicians. We need more Aboriginal education workers, say politicians. Can anyone see what's wrong with that? Let's try this. We need more Aboriginal doctors. We need more Aboriginal psychologists and psychiatrists. We need more Aboriginal teachers. You see the difference? The moment black people show themselves to be intelligent and capable, they cease to be black because racists define blackness as the absence of those capabilities. My PhD makes me less Aboriginal, apparently. So I become less grassroots Aboriginal because my PhD means that I'm not grassroots anymore. You couldn't get much more grassroots than me, but anyway, off you go. But it is that thing, isn't it, that we like to share space. If you're sharing space with Aboriginal people but not power, it's tokenism. There are too many systems that like to share space with us but not power. It's why paternalism is our greatest threat to black progress. And I'll make a joke of this. I say if I had, look about how many times I've been patted on the head for my achievements, I'd have a ball patch in the front of my head. Seriously. You like that one, didn't you? You like that one, good on you. My friend over there loves that joke. Okay, so, and here's the thing, good little Aboriginal, we got to year 10, and thank God I had parents that went, so what, this is so what, what's the next thing you're going to do, right? Okay, let's actually get into the stuff in terms of where we're at in relation to where I've got 8 minutes left. So I want to get into the Julia Institute. So I want to get into the geomapping first, solution in terms of geomapping. Okay, this is the data. I'm going to try to make sense of this in a very quick time that I've got left. Okay. There are disproportionately impacted families and regions that make up the bulk of the statistics. Let's look at the child protection data for a minute. Okay, in WA we have 60% of kids in care who are Indigenous, and you guys have 45%, but every single state is increasing by 1% each year, right? Every single one of you. Now, all I did from the data, there's 17 child protection districts in the state. All I did was I removed 4 regions that are the most densely populated black regions in the state. The Kimberley, the Pilbara where I'm from, the Goldfields and the Murchison, which are the most densely black populated regions in the state. And you know what happened? The child removal rates fell from 60% to nearly half, 39%. Now that's when data tells you something useful, that the most geographically, the people that carry most of the burden are the most remote and the most densely black populated regions. Okay, now let's look at the intimate partner violence stats, right? This is really interesting. I just did an opinion piece on this. So the Northern Territory gets a lot of, publicity around, intimate partner violence and so forth. Now, all we did, there's 76 remote communities in the Northern Territory, and all we did was took 10 communities out of that 76 from the data, right? And you know what happened? The data plummeted to half. So you know what that tells us? That 50% of the violence is occurring in just 13% of the communities. Okay, let's now look at the suicide rates. If we remove the Kimberley from the Indigenous versus non-Indigenous data, the data almost falls commensurate with mainstream, okay? So see how much more solvable the problem is when we bother to geomap data? And then you go into those regions and you see that violence tends to increase the odds of violence, not always. So for example, you have a parent who's violent, you have 4 kids, maybe one of those kids starts to internalise and becomes depressed. Maybe one of those kids has no impact. But one of those kids eventually is going to follow that future path, right? Every kid that I work with who's in prison has had someone in their background that's been to prison, right? If you geomap the kid prison data, which we don't, you would find that it's the same kids in and out of prison in about 70 to 80% of occasions, right? So the problem then becomes a lot more solvable than what people think it is. Now, why is it that the black regions, when you're in the majority, you are more oppressed and not less oppressed? That doesn't make sense, does it? If you're in the majority, you should be, you should be less oppressed. Well, guess what? South Africa had apartheid, and 80% of South Africans are black. Now, this is what I call collective fawn trauma. You have individual trauma as an Aboriginal person, and then you are othered, right? And so how do you actually fight these big systems? Well, you can't, so you go into fawn, right? So you go along with the human rights restrictions, you go along with all these sorts of things, because you don't have individual power and then you don't have collective power. So it makes sense that those regions are geographically our most high-risk regions. Now, I want to get into some fun stuff, guys, because this is where I come alive. Okay, so when all this was going on, 13 Indigenous young people died by suicide, and what actually happened in our own state of WA is that there was 18 months the inquiry went on for, and there was only 9 questions asked in the upper and lower House of Parliament about that inquiry, including what was going to be done about it. There was no call to action as a nation, there was no marching in the streets, it was invisible on our TVs, it was invisible everywhere. Our children's lives deserve more than silence, and that's all they got from our political leadership and Australia at large. If this were 13 non-Indigenous children, there would be marching in the streets, there'd be all those sorts of things. So why is there a differential reaction when it's black kids compared to white kids? And that's the racial empathy gap. So we kind of know that I could unpack that more for you if I had time, but it's a racial empathy gap. So I went, okay, I'm an Indigenous person, I'm a psychologist and I'm from a remote community, I can fix this. And so I did something, I had a platform on as the Australian Australia for WA, and I did something that really went absolutely against every single value I've been raised with, and that was I publicly announced my donation. Now the reason why I hated it was because charity's what you do when no one's paying attention, right? Now the only reason why I did it was because I wanted to guilt other people into into doing the same thing, right? And it worked, right? And interesting enough, I just thought, to be honest with you, I just thought I was going to fund one scholarship, to be honest. I didn't think it was going to grow into anything that big. Australia had other thoughts about it. And what happened very quickly is people were stopping me in airports and people were kind of going, how can we help, and all those sorts of things. And then I decided to go even stupider, and I decided that we were going to have a music concert in Western Australia, like the Bob Geldof, fixing world hunger type thing. No lofty goals at all. And I was sending all these, requests off to every high-profile person I knew in the whole country, and it was like reject. And then when I was in Alice Springs, the lovely John Butler, John Butler? Hang on a sec, I'll just pick up that name I just dropped. Hold on. I'll drop a few names. So the lovely John Butler said, be very honoured to play, and then we'd arrived, right? So we had the Pigram family and all amazing people. Everyone donated their time, and then COVID hit. So I had a hall of 1,000 to fill up, so no pressure, no stress. But we managed to get it done, and that basically brought things into the public domain, and people got on the drum and talked about that. We got massive donations through there, so it sort of took off from there. And then what actually happened was I was being interviewed on radio. I did something like 197 syndicated media, and I had like 30 million hits across my socials in 6 weeks, so it was actually really cool. And I had this lady on the radio say to me, Dr. Westerman, what's your aim for this scholarship? And I just off the cuff said, I want to build an army. I want hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, sorry, I get emotional talking about this. I want hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous psychologists through this country, so never again will a child die from a lack of access to services. Not on our watch, never again. And it just took off from there. So I think we end up, the Build an Army hashtag became a thing. We've got T-shirts, the hashtag Build an Army. So we are like a cult, but a good cult, right? Just don't drink the red cordial when you're around us, because anything could happen to you. So we are a good cult, and the kids, I call them kids, but they're not kids. So where we are now, when I started the scholarship program, we had just 218 Indigenous people registered as psychologists in this country, which means that we constitute 0.00005% of all psychologists out of 45,000. We now have 64 that we have supported or are supporting, and it gets better than that. We actually looked at the data from every university across the country and what they did with Indigenous people who enrolled in psychology. There's only been 1,039 Indigenous people enrolled in psychology in the history of the universe, which is actually really low. Universities graduate them at 20%. Gilia graduates them at 80%. I think the great thing about it too is that 70% of them are their first in their families to go to university. We're really unorthodox in terms of this scholarship, and we have to be unorthodox because our families are unorthodox, our communities are unorthodox. I don't select students based on grades. I select them based on how many more gaps they have to close than others. So if we've got, and we do, every single one of them comes from significant disadvantage. None of them come from generational financial wealth or educational advantage or whatever. And so what Julia gives them is we give them the privilege of failure. Greatness has always been predicated on the privilege of failure. And my parents, in closing the gap for me in one generation, afforded me the privilege of failure. So every single one of our students and Indigenous people, we don't get to fail. We don't get to a second, third, fourth chance. We fail once, our futures are limited. And so yes, it's the financial part of it, but it's also the fact that we give them a family and we give them that safety net that they've never, ever, ever had, and the luxury of failure. And so many of them have come. It's not about, anyone a Ted Lasso fan in the room? A Ted Lasso fan? So Ted Lasso talks about it's not about the wins and losses. So my messaging has always been it's not about the grades, right? Your academic transcript only represents how many more barriers you've had to overcome. And when we actually model black excellence and we put them in a room with other black people who have been through the same disadvantage and all the rest of it and are still shooting through the stars, that then becomes the new norm, right? And they're all just smashing it. They're getting clinical masters. They're doing all sorts of amazing stuff, sort of as you can see there. So we have just employed our first Julia clinical psychologist, so our OG, the first recipient of the scholarship in the $50,000 recipient. She graduated a year and a half ago as a clinical psychologist, and we've just employed her in Julia as a clinical psychologist registrar. How cool is that? Our research arm is funded by Paul Ramsey, so they gave us our first operational funding about 1.5 years ago. Thank God for that, because then we could breathe for the first time. Okay, so being responsible for people's salaries and wages hasn't been easy. It hasn't been easy. I think there's probably been about 1,000 times a year that I've just found it so overwhelming I wanted to chuck it in. But I've got amazing people around me that go, Tracy, this is too important. It's too important. And they're right. 17 graduates since 2024, 5 now employed in Julia. So once they graduate, we're giving them a home. Okay, so what we hope to have is a base of Julia in every single state of Australia so that we can value add to critical services on the ground. So when it becomes complex, Julia sits above you guys, okay? So we're hoping New South Wales will have a base very soon because we've got some pretty deadly students that are actually based in New South Wales. Now, this is where they're coming from, guys, in terms of where they're at. Now, it's a pretty simple model, hey? We're going into our highest risk, most remote communities and skills building from the ground up. So we have 5 from Alice Springs, we have 6 from the Kimberley, we have kids from Halls Creek, Derby, Rockhampton, Tennant Creek, 7 from the Northern Territory. So we're going into our highest risk communities, Walgett on our radar as well, and Cherbourg. If we skills build from the ground up, locals never leave because they are truly invested in hope. They are truly invested in giving their children a better opportunities than what they had, and locals never leave. The fly-in, fly-out model that governments actually promote has generationally failed us, and it's generationally failed our most at-risk families and communities. And it also teaches us as Indigenous people to look outside of our communities to be rescued. And we know that we have the fundamental answers to these things. But the trouble is that governments like to share space with us but not power with us. And that's why when people say to me, why haven't government ever done this? That's because they like to share space with us but not power. You have an Indigenous psychologist around the table, see what outcomes you get. You know, they'll be very, very different. Okay, guys, this is where they are. Representation matters. You cannot be what you have not seen. Okay, now they can be what they can see. So every single kid that comes from Alice Springs, that now becomes their norm. Every kid that comes from Derby or Halls Creek or Rockhampton or Tennant Creek, that now becomes their norm because they can be what they can see. Okay, I'm going to finish with a bit of shameless self-promotion. Some of you may be aware that was always going to happen, right? You might be aware, that I released my memoir last year, which was a lot of fun, and it's actually going pretty well. It even gave me a bloody award last couple of weeks ago. That was pretty funny. Given that I didn't have an orthodox education, so being awarded for my writing is a little bit weird because I sort of basically self-taught. So it's actually going really well. I actually got, I'll do signing for people. I've got about half an hour to do that if people are interested in purchasing a copy. I've got a couple of my students who I've pimped out to help me, which is actually really good. And the other one too, a little bit more of shameless self-promotion, is just my workshop. So I'll be holding, I've only got one workshop that enables people to be accredited and all that stuff that you've just talked about. So only one for the year. And then I'm taking a big 6-month break at the end of the year. We'll see how that goes. We'll see how long that lasts for. See how we go. But yeah, and it's also available virtually as well, so people can just log on and attend. So that's the only one that we're doing. Now, would you mind if I end with just a really quick video on the students? It's actually so cool. So get the tissues out. I have to hide behind something because my tough Pilbara reputation, you know, when I tear up is not good. I see a lot of videos from the students because they're great at it, but this one did me in. Because what it does is it shows the students when they first got the scholarship to current date. And when you see them, they are so freaking cute. There's some that just have like pupily faces or stuff, and now they're like grown men, you know. And so it's extraordinary. So I'm just going to play that for you, just to end on a really high note for you. So I think I have to go backwards on this. Hopefully we go backwards. These little thingamybobs. Here we go, backwards. Can we press play on that behind there?
The scholarship has had such a big impact on me. Knowing that I'm a part of a team of Indigenous psychologists that's just going to grow and grow as we head into the future just gives me so much hope, so much motivation to get through my degree.
Where I'm from, we have one of the highest rates of suicide in the world. This has led to me wanting to make a difference in my community. what I wish to achieve once I finish my degree is to apply my learnings to other families that have faced similar barriers to what we have, other young people, and to the community.
I feel very fortunate and inspired to have someone like Tracy in my corner to support and guide me through my journey.
The scholarship has been able to help me in a multitude of ways. Obviously the financial benefits, but also the help and wisdom and guidance that you get from Dr. Tracy Westerman herself.